If there was a time when corruption and malfeasance seemed to be primarily problems of petty dictators in faraway lands, the world has lost its naivete about that, particularly as light shone on the Russian oligarchs amid the war in Ukraine. The problem of global kleptocracy now has our attention. With us to explain, in Hey on Why United Kingdom, Oliver Bullough, journalist and author of Butler to the World: How Britain Became the Servant of Tycoons, Tax Dodgers, Kleptocrats, and Criminals. In Devon, also in the United Kingdom, Tom Burgess, investigative reporter at the Financial Times and author of Kleptopia: How Dirty Money is Conquering the World. And in Washington, D.C., Sarah Chayes, author of On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. She's a former special advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. And we're very happy to have you three with us here on TVO tonight. Let me just read back a couple of lines that each of you has had to say. Oliver, in 2020, you wrote that, quote, kleptocracy is for the 21st century what fascism and communism were for much of the 20th. And Tom, last month you said the most dangerous threat to our freedom is the rise of kleptocracy. And you said that, incidentally, on the courthouse steps in London right after you won a libel case filed by some of the kleptocrats that you wrote about in your book. So, okay, we've had Oliver and Tom have their say, so Sarah, you get the first kick at this question. Let's define what we're talking about here. Kleptocracy, what is it?
It is the capture of the politics and economy of a country by a network that includes members of government, business tycoons, and very often out-and-out criminals. And the people in this network who control levers of power don't just use those levers of power to enrich themselves. They also bend and twist the agencies and institutions that they run so that those government agencies serve not the people, but the kleptocrats and their addiction to infinite wealth.
Oliver, follow up on that, if you would, by telling us why you believe kleptocracy has been the defining feature of this century in the way that, say, fascism and communism were the evils of the last century.
Well, the great difference between kleptocracy and the two great autocracies of the 20th century is the fact that it's so much a product of a globalized financial system. The fact that it is now so easy to steal large amounts of money and to hide that money in the nooks and crannies of the offshore financial system through financial centers like London is essentially, it results in a system which isn't just a problem over there. It's also a problem right here, whether right here is Canada or right here is the UK or right here is the US or any other Western country, because the money flows out of places like Russia or China or Afghanistan or Nigeria, and it flows out of those places into Western capitals via the financial system with the assistance of lawyers and accountants and so on in our own countries. And when it's here, it can buy influence and in a way that essentially makes it much harder to fight against than the dictatorships of the past.
We will come back to that angle of how the West is enabling all of this a little further in our discussion. But Tom, you've got this line that you've said, the thieves are uniting. What do you mean by that?
Well, let me take you back for a moment, as I do in Kleptopia, to the Zimbabwean election of 2008. There was an extraordinary thing that was about to happen then. Robert Mugabe was about to lose power in an election. Indeed, he did lose an election. But Robert Mugabe doesn't lose elections, so he had to mobilize his thuggery machine to make sure that his kleptocracy would remain in power. Now, that costs money. You have to buy supplies, weapons, you have to pay people off, to incentivize people to deploy violence. And he got $100 million. And where did he get that $100 million? He got it from taking hold of a mine, handing that mine to control of an offshore company of the kind Oliver describes, that was controlled by one of his business cronies, a white Zimbabwean. And then that mine was moved to through a corporate deal to a London-listed mining company, with the backing of a Wall Street hedge fund. Mugabe used that money, brutalized the opposition, stole that election, and remained in power for another 12 years, another quarter of a lifetime, if you're unfortunate enough to be a Zimbabwean living under his rule. And then this Zimbabwean mine and a few other African assets were packaged together and ended up under the control of some Central Asian oligarchs with connections going back to the KGB and a regime that has links to Donald Trump. Now, you put that together, that's just one example of how around the world, both in countries we recognize as kleptocracies like Zimbabwe or Russia, but also in the great capitals of democracy, London, Washington, and so on, these networks of power that Sarah describes have gone global, and they are hoarding power and wealth in such a way that it's becoming utterly unaccountable. The rule of law has not gone global. That's stayed within nation states. And we are reaching up into the ether, trying to hold people like Putin and his allies in the West to account, but often finding that what we hold on to vanishes within our grasp because we have allowed this secrecy system to take hold.
Well, Sarah, could you follow up on that in this regard? Is kleptocracy and the oligarchs that employ it, or who are responsible for it, is this a kind of a natural outcome of globalization in your view?
I think the two are intertwined. I think that you saw a major shift in culture around the year 1980, where money once again, as it had at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, money in and of itself became increasingly the sole marker of social status. So you start seeing the kind of adoration of wealth starting again. And then the deregulation and globalization wave of the 1990s really made the amassing and, as both Tom and Oliver have said, the hiding away and transferring across national boundaries of this accumulated wealth much, much easier. And so I think the two are very closely combined. And I also think the network building did happen in a particular way in the former Soviet space, where you had the former government officials who were in charge of giving people favors, the people who had begun to experiment with being entrepreneurs in the West, had gotten to understand how the Western banking and legal systems worked, and then the out and out kind of Russian mafia wove themselves together into the type of transnational networks that we're all discussing.
Well, Oliver, you actually go back to pre-globalization days. You make reference to the Suez Crisis in 1956. How come? What's important about that?
Well, I mean, you need essentially a network, as Sarah said, and a network requires or requires a physical architecture for that network to run through. The money needs wires down which the messages can move. It needs social connections, people who know each other, bankers that know each other. This is criminal wealth. This is illicit activity. They need to trust each other. And that network was born out of the dying embers of the British Empire. The British Empire had the network, it just no longer existed, but the people still all knew each other. And the thing that the Suez Crisis did, this diplomatic fiasco that brought the British Empire essentially to an end, certainly it was what made the end of the British Empire inevitable, also gave birth to this curious phenomenon whereby the pound largely ceased to be used as an international currency because of restrictions placed on its use by the British government. And the bankers in London, in the desperate search for a new way of making a living, switched to using the dollar. And when they used the dollar in London, they made this amazing discovery, which is that by using a dollar in the UK, there were no British rules because they weren't using British currency. And there were no American rules because they weren't acting in the United States. They had created essentially a legal hole within a country where no rules applied. And they needed a concept to describe what they'd done. What had they discovered? And they used a concept from maritime law. Essentially, what happens if you move out of the reach of a country's jurisdiction, out onto the high seas, you are offshore. You are no longer somewhere where it's subject to the rules of government. And so this concept, offshore, the legal spaces, which are essentially outside any government's control, are tolerated by governments because they are profitable, because they bring business to their bankers and to their lawyers and their accountants and so on. And they essentially provide loopholes through which initially just dollars could flow, but increasingly anything can flow. The giant kleptocratic networks that the other two have been talking about essentially exist because of their ability to hide their wealth in and through and around these loopholes, which were first opened up in the City of London thanks to the Suez Crisis, but now have spread, far more widely throughout the last remaining bits of the British Empire, places like the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Gibraltar, and so on, but also to other places, South Dakota, improbable places like South Dakota, more probable places like Hong Kong, Singapore, Cyprus. It is an entire network of centers all around the world, joined together by modern communications, and money flows between them in the flash of a photon. And when before the police have even got out of bed, the criminal wealth has gone around the world 3 or 4 times, and it's almost impossible to find it again.
Well, Tom, let's see if we can figure out a little bit more about who they are. You told us in your first answer, as it related to Zimbabwe, it was a very rich person who owned a mine. Who else are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, typically what we're talking about is a dictator and their entourage. So they tend to fit a pattern of people who've seized control of oil, gas, or mineral-rich countries. As far as the global economy is concerned, the way to make real money in most of Africa, Latin America, and large parts of Asia is to capture the basic resources of the global economy and do deals with Western multinationals that will treat you as the legitimate person to sell those. So some of the list is long, but there are a few prominent faces in that rogues gallery. I mentioned Mugabe. Obviously, Putin is the sort of king kleptocrat because he's done such an extraordinary job of fusing kleptocracy and foreign policy, whether it be using gas or using disinformation or using missiles. The Chinese Communist Party has shown itself to be pretty kleptocratic and does and under Xi Jinping has done one of the classic maneuvers of kleptocracy, which is to use the quasi anti-corruption campaign as a weapon to take out your enemy. So in a system where everybody is corrupt, obviously you can accuse anyone you want of corruption, and there'll be some pretty good evidence to support that. I think one really important point to make, really important, perhaps the most important thing to remember, is that kleptocracy is not geographical. It's simply the use of power, it's a systematic use of power for the enrichment of those who hold power. Now, just as there are Democrats, brave Democrats in Moscow, there are very much kleptocrats in Washington and London and the other capitals of democracy. And I would say the biggest one of all in recent years is Donald Trump. Part of what I try to show in my book, Kleptopia, is how Trump, for many, many years, when he was essentially pretending to be a businessman, he was a hopeless businessman, but he was sustained in his property career by flows of dark money from the former Soviet Union, from the great engine of the global kleptocracy. And combine that with a successful turn in reality television as a kind of business genius. And you have the recipe for his presidential run. And then in office, he governs as a kleptocrat. He knows which side his bread is buttered on. He knows which forces have been sustaining him for so long, and he joins the club. Look at his allies in office. His friendship with Putin, Kim in the Kim dynasty in North Korea, another.
Okay, I think
great
none of this, though,
and
Tom,
so on.
I think none of this is going to shock anybody. However,
but if I can just come back on that point, I do think it shocks people because I don't think people think of it in this way. I think people get, as with Putin, people get distracted by the rhetoric. They think of these people as nationalists, as populists, right? But that is the diversion. What's actually going on is corruption, and that's what it's so crucial to get through Putin or Trump's kind of nationalist bombast and look at what the engine of their power actually is, and that's just self-enrichment.
Well, I was going to say, Sarah, I mean, your book's called On Corruption in America, and it may not come as a shock to many people watching or listening to this that Trump is on the list, but Oliver just mentioned South Dakota. I mean, there are kleptocrats in South Dakota?
So I'd like to make a distinction because I think that we, even now, even as you say, Steve, that we are beginning to think about kleptocracy much more seriously than we did before, the end of February, there's still a tendency to see the kleptocrats as being over there, right? Over there in kind of exotic places like Angola or Afghanistan or Nigeria or Russia even. Whereas, and to see our sin in the West as largely being a sin of enablers. And I think that is the last piece of this that we really need to break down and understand that not only are our bankers and real estate agents and registered agents and whatnot, lawyers, assisting, quote, the kleptocrats over there, the rogues gallery, but in fact, our own systems are increasingly resembling the systems that we can find in a place like Nigeria or Afghanistan or Russia. And by that, I mean, take a look at the interconnected, interwoven webs that dominate our own politics and economies. And often we talk about some of these countries that are beset by kleptocracy as fragile or failing states. And I think that what the three of us would all agree is to say that, well, yeah, they're failing as states, but their kleptocratic networks are incredibly successful at enriching themselves. Well, I'm speaking to you from Washington, right? Mm-hmm. So around this city is this forest of massive McMansions. And they are largely owned by people from the defense industry, people from the financial services industry, people who lobby for those industries or for the fossil fuel industry, or let's say medical giants, right? Now let's take a look at the policies that we've seen that these very executives and their lobbyists have either influenced or themselves in office promulgated. And we see, a financial meltdown that starts to approach the Great Depression in magnitude in 2008. We see 2 lost wars. We see, a very botched response to a global pandemic. And we see, the collapse of our living ecosystem around us. And what I would ask us is, are we not also starting to look almost like a state that's being destroyed, being turned into a failing state by its kleptocratic leaders? And it is Trump, but it's not only Trump.
Well, Oliver, if our actions are helping to enable kleptocrats to do their thing around the world and at home, why are we enabling it? Why are we doing it?
Well, I think Sarah's made a very good point here. I mean, let's face it, Putin, for all of his friendship with certain Western politicians, whether that's Viktor Orban in Hungary or Nigel Farage in London, or indeed Donald Trump in the US, he doesn't have a very big lobby in Western capitals. Neither do any of the kleptocrats, really. Who does have a big lobby are the big corporations, the big tech giants, and the very wealthy Western entrepreneurs and billionaires. And they love using exactly the same networks as Putin and the Chinese oligarchs or the Nigerian oligarchs use. They move their money through the same offshore tax havens. They move their money through the same kind of financial instruments. I mentioned South Dakota, which has this curiously large trust industry, which has grown up particularly in the last 10 or 15 years. Yes, that's popular with Chinese billionaires, but it's overwhelmingly popular with American billionaires. They like dodging taxes as much as the next man, if not rather more. And that is the real challenge for Western governments to face, is this gradual erosion of the principle of everyone being equal before the law and everyone being equal before the tax authorities, because there are so many loopholes which are available only to people who can afford them. So, if the problem was only Putin or even President Xi and their financial skullduggery, I think we'd be able to solve that. They don't have that many defenders when the chips are down. The problem is that essentially they are piggybacking onto a system that was created by Western corporations, allowing Western corporations to evade tax or avoid tax on an industrial scale thanks to jurisdictions like Bermuda and so on. And that's the real challenge, because there are very, very few Western governments who are prepared to face up to our own kleptocrats, the corporations who are, if they're not actually stealing things, it's only because we've made what they do legal.
Well, Tom, just so I'm clear, are we making an equivalent here, an equivalency between Russian-style kleptocracy and what goes on, for example, in London, UK, or in Washington, D.C.? Because certainly my sense is the public's view of this would be that's a level of kleptocracy in the Russian capital that is quite a bit different from what we're experiencing in the West. But is it different?
Well, I think the point one of the points we're all three driving at is to say that it's a mistake to see these things geographically. We live in a global economy, and so if we talk about the Russian kleptocracy, what do we really mean there? That some of the biggest corporate players, certainly until very, very recent times, were in the Russian economy were Western oil companies. I mean, how do we think they secured their access and contracts in a notoriously corrupt regime?
They cut in Mr. Putin for 50% of everything, is what we hear.
Well, yes, but we also hear that there are subtler elements to it than that. I mean, sure, there occasionally we see a straight up bribery case. One of them comes to light. The Department of Justice in the US gets a whistleblower, whatever it may be, and we see under the bonnet of the global economy, if you like. But I think that the point I'm driving at is that whether it be, as Oliver says, by advancing Russian causes through lobbying in Washington by an oil company that wants to advance its interest in Russia, let's say, or straight up bribery, or simply by our purchases of Russian oil and gas. I mean, what do we think happens to the money that we spend on Russian oil and gas, or Saudi oil, or Nigerian oil, or Congolese cobalt, and the list goes on and on. Even if this is not straight up bribery, as it often is, even in the cases where we are simply buying this product, we know that it's being stolen. We know that we're in bed with a corrupt regime. So I think the trick is to see these things as transnational networks of money and power, where the corporate interests in Houston, the political interests in the Kremlin, and a despot clinging to power in Zimbabwe, they all have their interests are more interlocked with each other than with any of the, if you like, ordinary people in whose name these people wield power.
I want to read, Sarah, to you and get you to comment rather first on a quote. This is from an interview with the author of another book on this, American Kleptocracy, where he's talking about one Ukrainian kleptocrat in particular and why he puts his money into the United States. And here's the quote. What he, this kleptocrat, ended up doing was moving that money not into Manhattan high-rises, the South Florida real estate landscape, or places in Southern California. He ended up going, of all places, to Cleveland, Ohio. He ended up pouring hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of unaccounted foreign money, anonymous money, into small towns, steel towns, factory towns, and manufacturing plants across the American Midwest, across the Rust Belt, across the American heartland. I mean, I guess I don't want to, hammer this point too much, but again, this is not what we think of when we think of kleptocracies, investing in parts of America that many people tend to think of as yesterday's news, not tomorrow's news. Do we have to rethink our vision of what this is?
Yes, and I want to go back to the rethinking. So quite interestingly, those very places are places where there is an epidemic of evictions. So here, again, we're used to thinking of kleptocracy as leading to poverty and conflict in places like Angola or Nigeria or Afghanistan. But the very same poverty is being produced in our own Western countries. And it's being produced by, in the case you referred to, a Ukrainian kleptocrat. But once again, I want to bring this back home. I want to say that, yes, Washington resembles Moscow way more than we want to think about it or we want to understand. And so I'm not trying to make a false equivalency here, but I do think there's more of a real equivalency than we're even willing to let ourselves understand, because it's not just that we're selling Ukrainian buildings. Let me give you one example. President Biden just nominated Sarah Bloom Raskin to be vice president of the Federal Reserve, our central bank. Ms. Raskin had as a private citizen, said that it would be important for the financial sector to analyze climate risk as part of the systemic risk that might affect the financial system. For that, she was refused even a hearing, even a vote in committee. Why? Because a key US senator is completely beholden to the fossil fuel industry in the United States. So the point is that kleptocrats don't just use financial and such institutions to hide their money. Inside government, they actually bend and twist the levers of government, the very institutions and agencies that they control, and they use their power over and influence over elected officials to force the government to serve their purposes and to ignore really obvious, public concerns like the potential effect of climate crisis on the financial system.
Oliver, this sounds like law enforcement worldwide is bringing a knife to a gunfight. It sounds like they're hopelessly mismatched, in which case, is there anything that can be done about this?
Yeah, I mean, there are some places that are better than others. The US does at least try to bring these cases. The UK, I'm not sure we've ever bothered. Most European countries don't bother. And then in places like Ukraine or Russia, the law enforcement are actually part of the kleptocratic systems themselves. They're essentially the foot soldiers of the kleptocratic government. I mean, what can we do about it? Well, we need to think transnationally, just as the kleptocrats act transnationally, as Tom and Sarah said. We're talking about a global class, essentially, a nomadic class of kleptocrats with no loyalty to any one country, only loyalty to the wealth which they're trying to extract. So we need to approach them transnationally. There's been some really impressive advances in journalism by groups like the ICIJ and the OCCRP, who work in these networks to try and investigate these crimes in multiple countries simultaneously. Our police services need to be able to do this too. There's been some signs in the last 6 weeks that the White House and the other G7 countries have been chivying police services towards doing this. They got this what they call it, klepto capture, slightly unfortunate name, but that's what they're calling it. And that's great. If they can share information, that's good. But they also need to have information to share. And this really gets to the heart of what I think needs doing most urgently, which is it's just incredibly hard to hide your ownership. Incredibly easy to hide your ownership of stolen wealth behind shell companies from multiple jurisdictions, whether those are limited partnerships from some of the Canadian provinces, whether that's LLCs from some of the more opaque US states, or whether that's limited liability partnerships from the UK, or companies or partnerships from elsewhere. There are so many options to choose from. And when they're combined together into these chains of structures, they become almost unbreakable, even by the most potent police services. So what we really desperately need is proper transparency of ownership, verified transparency, so we can cut all the way through these corporate structures and see who actually owns what. And that will really expose so many of these corporations as total fictions, which exist only to obfuscate the property of the oligarchs who are increasingly dominating the world. And if, as ordinary citizens, we wish to fight back and try and reclaim some power for democracy against kleptocracy, what we need is knowledge to empower us to know who owns what, who owns our countries, who's funding our elections, who's buying our politicians. And that can only be done if we can see who owns the companies that are doing it. So true ownership transparency is something that's absolutely crucial. And there are steps in this direction. There have been commitments from the Canadian government. There's been commitments from the US government, some commitments as well from the UK government, and also within the EU, which is all great, but it's happening way too slowly. The money is being stolen. By some estimates, more than $1 trillion a year is being stolen and hidden offshore. All of that money is money that does not want to be identified and exposed. And the longer we leave this, the harder it's going to be to essentially force its owners to reveal what they own.
Sarah, we're literally down to our last 30 seconds here. How much hope do you hold that the prescription that Oliver just gave is possible?
I don't believe in hope. I believe in determination. It's up to us, the people, to understand that this problem is exactly as existential as both Tom and Oliver have described it as being.
Well, we'll go with determination as opposed to hope then. That sounds like very good advice. Sarah Chayes, Tom Burgess, Oliver Bullough, it's really good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.